Good morning, everyone. If I seem dazed and confused to you this morning, I apologize. In the last week and a half, I have been in Rome, then in Denver, Colorado, then in Los Angeles, California, and finally Las Vegas, Nevada, before arriving here in DC tonight. I barely have any sense of what time zone I'm in or what I'm supposed to be doing, but I'm a journalist. I think you come to expect confusion and the occasional fog of verbiage. I am the editor of an online Catholic news site called Crux, that is C-R-U-X. It is found at cruxnow.com. This is cruxnow.com. Where for a long time now we have had a particular focus on issues of anti-Christian persecution. The important thing, I think, is to note that we approach this topic not as they do in the heady environs of Washington from a policy perspective, but instead we try to tell the stories of victims. We try to get out into the field, meet the people who are suffering as a result of anti-Christian persecution and violations of religious freedom, and put faces and names on the broad picture with which we are all familiar. We all know this is a world in which violations of religious freedom occur on a staggering scope and scale. If we are to talk specifically about Christians, the low-end estimate for the number of new Christian martyrs every year in the world today is around 8,000. The high-end estimate is somewhere close to 100,000. Now, however you run those numbers, what that works out to is a Christian dying for his or her faith either every 5 minutes or every hour of every year and often in the most staggering and grotesque fashion you can imagine. So to try to bring home the drama, the human drama of this story, what I would like to do is simply tell you about three victims of anti-Christian persecution I have met over the last, say, 5 years. We can begin with Nabil Solomon in Egypt. Nabil is the closest thing to an analog of the biblical figure of Job I have ever encountered. In 2013, Nabil was serving as a Christian security guard in his village in Upper Egypt. It was a secure middle-class position. His family enjoyed basic stability and harmony with their environment. After the Muslim Brotherhood government was dislodged in Egypt, a backlash of anti-Christian rage swept through this part of Egypt. A mob of jihadist Muslim Brotherhood sympathizers entered Nabil's village. They grabbed him at the mayor's office where he was paid to be the security guy. They also set fire to his home. And they basically chased his wife and 4 children from that home. The children, the children fled immediately to Cairo. Nabil's wife stayed behind because she wanted to be with him. What happened was the mob that grabbed him paraded him through the streets of the village. They invited people to punch, kick, and spit upon him. He was then brought into a police station where a sort of impromptu rump trial was conducted, in which he was found guilty of murdering a kind of local thug, who, by the way, abundant witnesses would document was in a village 300 miles away on the day that this murder allegedly took place, and that Nabil was at home on the job. In other words, there was no physical possibility he could have committed this crime. Yet, he was told that he had 2 choices. One, he had to get out of the village, or 2, if he ever came back, he would be, these charges of murder would be reinstated, he would be prosecuted and eventually executed. By the way, he was also told he would be leaving without his pension, property, bank accounts, or anything that had once belonged to him. So he and his wife set out for Cairo. I met him in Cairo 3 years ago, where Nabil is living in, and Cairo, as you know, has some of the most extreme poverty in the world, but this is one of the worst neighborhoods in some of the roughest areas of Cairo. He has a two-room apartment which now contains his children, grandchildren, his wife, and himself. It has no electricity or running water. The choices basically on a summer day, which is when we were there, are to open a window which looks out onto an open sewer, so that you are, if you open that window, the immediate influx of flies is so overwhelming you think you're in a scene from the book of Exodus, or you leave it shut and essentially suffocate from heat. Nabil, by the way, is one of roughly 10 million Egyptians who are infected with hepatitis C. And he no longer can afford the medications necessary to hold it at bay. So this is, in effect, a slow-motion death sentence. Okay? That's Nabil's situation. Let me talk briefly about Rebecca Beatrice, a young Nigerian woman I met in Rome earlier this year in April, when she had an audience with Pope Francis that was organized by Aid to the Church in Need. Rebecca is a victim of Boko Haram. She had lived, very simple, illiterate young woman. She had lived in a small village in small, predominantly Christian village, which is an anomaly in northern Nigeria, which is largely Muslim. One day in 2014, Boko Haram gunmen stormed into her village. People immediately fled. She was separated from her husband, but managed to hold on to her two small children. They were 7 and 5 at the time, two small sons. And they split out for a nearby forest. They were eventually captured and brought into a Boko Haram camp, where Rebecca, along with the other young women who had been captured, at gunpoint was asked to convert to Islam. When she declined, she was struck in the head with the butt of the rifle. When she declined again, one of the gunmen decided that she needed an object lesson in the failures of compliance. So they grabbed her 5-year-old son and threw him into the river, this raging river that was right by the camp, and forced her to watch him drown. And then gave her the choice of watching that again with her older son or going along. She chose to go along, although, as she describes it, this is always with a mental reservation. In fact, during the 5 times daily when she was compelled to do the Islamic prayer, she says she was actually in her mind reciting the rosary. When the camp was, oh, by the way, she was then forcibly married to one of the Boko Haram members and forced to endure for months on end what amounted to serial acts of rape. She conceived a child and gave birth to this child in the camp. When the camp was finally liberated by the Nigerian army 2 years into this experience, she and her son once again took refuge, well, they took off, fleeing for their lives, again into the forest. She brought her older son, but fully intended to leave the younger son in the forest because she felt that, that he was not meant to be her child, that it was in fact a penalty of war. Her older son, rather, however, pleaded with her, saying that I have lost my brother, perhaps he can be my brother. So Rebecca picked him up again. They eventually returned to their village and made it to a larger town in northern Iraq where they felt they would be safe, or northern Nigeria, sorry, where they felt they would be safe. And there she was persuaded by the local pastor to accept this boy as her own son. She had him baptized with the name of Christophe. Today, she says, she has forgiven those who did this to her in the spirit of Christ on the cross, that she wants no vengeance, she wants no payback. She says she is simply interested in making sure that other young Christian women in her nation do not undergo the same experiences. And finally, let me mention Kanaka Nayak, who I had an opportunity to meet in India when we were doing reporting there 3 or 4 years ago. Kayaka is one of the so-called widows of Kandhamal. Kandhamal, if you don't know, was the most widespread and brutal anti-Christian pogrom anywhere in Asia in the early 21st century. It unfolded in 2008 when bands of radical Hindu militants, outraged by the slaying of a local holy man, stormed into largely Christian villages and performed atrocities that almost boggle the imagination in the 21st century. Kanaka's husband was a Baptist preacher who was grabbed by these Hindu militants. He was dragged into the central square of his village. He was kicked and stoned as his assailants insisted that he reconvert to Hinduism, even though he was born Christian. When he refused, they then buried him up to the neck in the square for 3 agonizing days, inviting people to kick him in the head, to throw stones at him, to abuse him in any manner they liked. On the 3rd day, they took him out, realized that he was not going to convert, and so they then strapped him to a pole where they cut his throat, sliced open his belly, ripped out his intestines, put them around their necks, and paraded around the village, sporting them as sort of macabre war trophies. Kanaka, when you talk to her today, like Rebecca, is stunningly free of rancor, despite having witnessed those horrors and her small children having been forced to witness them. She too has processed this spiritually as an invitation to forgiveness, an invitation to the participation in the sufferings of Christ on the cross. She too, however, says that her main interest right now is creating a climate in India in which her fellow Christian sisters and brothers do not have to fear similar experiences. I think the conclusion of all of this is, yes, it is a fascinating question to analyze the impact of war on violations of religious freedom. I think the no-brainer conclusion is that war generally is not good for religious freedom. We see that today all around the planet, but I think the more important implication, and there are 2. One is for victims of violations of religious freedom and anti-Christian persecution. They are already in a war. They suffer the same trauma. They suffer the same long-term legacy. They suffer the same agony. They suffer the same fear for the future as victims of any other sort of conflict. So however we analyze ultimately the roots of religious freedom, we need to recognize that these are war victims among us who need the same kinds of support, the same kind of care, the same kind of accompaniment as victims of all violent and traumatic conflict. I think the other point is that for those of us in the West, it is easy sometimes to think of violations of religious freedom as an event, something that happens and then is over with. We talk about the Kandhamal pogrom in 2008 as if it is now a closed chapter of history. It happened back then, and we write about it in history books and anniversaries and retrospectives. But for the people whose lives were scarred that day, this is not closed. Violations of religious freedom for them are not an event. They are a legacy. They become their lives. They define, in many ways, both the physical, the psychological, and the spiritual challenges of the rest of their lives. We may think, for instance, in northern Iraq, and I just got back from the Nineveh Plains in northern Iraq, we may think in northern Iraq, if we succeed in rebuilding the Nineveh Plains and helping those Christians get back to their homes who were driven out by ISIS, we may think that's job done. It isn't. Putting up a home is the beginning of the recovery process, not the end. So I can only echo everything you have heard and will hear from the other speakers on this panel about the urgency of this issue. And I promise you that at Crux, we are going to keep telling the human stories, I think, that demonstrate why, in my view, this is the most compelling and often the most undertold Christian story of the early 21st century. Thank you.